A torch snaps to life, and suddenly the night has teeth. You're looking at the walls of Abomey, mud brick ramparts slick with humidity, palm fronds rattling in a warm wind that smells of smoke and shea butter. Drums thud from inside the compound like a second heartbeat. In the flicker, a line of women steps forward, not in panic, but in perfect rhythm. Their muskets are old, their bayonets are not. Someone whispers the name outsiders will later turn into a myth. Amazons. Now picture the French officers a few miles away, boots sinking in red earth, uniforms too tight for West African heat. They were briefed with the usual colonial confidence. Primitive kingdom, easy show of force. Local resistance will scatter. And then their scouts report something that doesn't fit the script. Women drilling, marching, singing war songs that sound like promises. Here's the hook. The Dahomey Amazons weren't a quirky footnote or a costume drama fantasy. They were the sharp end of a kingdom's survival strategy, an all-female corps that helped build an empire, enforce a ruthless economy, and then collide head-on with Europe's industrial war machine. And if we're honest, their story forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when extraordinary courage serves a cause that isn't clean? Static visual cue. Hold on a 19th century illustration of Dahomey women with rifles. Notice the posture, chin lifted, eyes forward, as if the artist accidentally captured the moment before the storm. Look at the map, a small inland kingdom in today's Benin, pressed between rival states and, soon, European powers with paperwork, cannons, and appetites. In that squeeze, King Behanzin is gambling with everything he has. The women in front of you are his wager, and also his warning. Somewhere in that line is a recruit who is terrified and thrilled at the same time, because fear is allowed, but hesitation isn't. Tonight, one decision will decide who becomes legend and who becomes a name no one writes down. The drums speed up, the gate opens, and the real story begins on the other side. If you could freeze a still image of Abomey in the 1700s, you'd see order built out of heat and dust. The palace is a city within a city. Courtyards of packed earth, carved wooden doors, walls painted with symbols, sharks, lightning, leopards, each one a political statement you can almost hear. Outside, markets buzz with cola nuts, cloth, gossip, and fear. Because Dahomey is rising, and rising kingdoms don't do it politely. The kings of Dahomey are not dreaming of culture. They are thinking in borders, tribute, captives, and gunpowder. Every rival state is a threat. Every alliance is temporary. In that world, the palace must be protected like a vault. Legend versus evidence moment number 1. Later storytellers sometimes say the Amazons began as a romantic band of warrior wives who simply refused to stay home. The sources we can actually trace, court traditions mixed with early European observers, suggest something more practical. Women serving as palace guards and hunters, gradually formalized because they were available, loyal, and, crucially, close to the king. Static visual cue. Show a map of the Bight of Benin and trace inland to Abomey. Notice how Dahomey sits like a fist behind the coast, with trade routes leading to the sea like nerves. Imagine a young woman selected for service. She's not chosen because the king believes in empowerment. She's chosen because the palace needs bodies that won't be bribed by outsiders. She feels pride, yes, but also the chill of realizing she is being pulled into the king's orbit, where obedience can become identity. And the king? He has his own private fear. If the palace falls, so does the story of his right to rule. So he builds protection that looks, at first glance, like a curiosity. But curiosities don't march in formation, don't sleep with weapons beside them, don't learn to move like one creature with 100 hands. Somewhere in the courtyards, a drum pattern changes, faster, sharper. It's the sound of training beginning. And the next thing you'll see, if you dare to look closer, is what Dahomey demands from the women at arms. The first lesson is not how to shoot. It's how to belong. Picture a still photo of a parade ground at dawn. Mist lifting off red soil, lines of women barefoot or in simple sandals, each with a musket hugged to the chest like a sleeping child. An officer, also a woman, walks the ranks with the calm of someone who has already decided you are breakable. Training in Dahomey is built to erase the old life. Recruits learn to run long distances, to climb, to wrestle, to reload quickly with fingers slick from sweat. They chant, not to get hyped, but to synchronize breathing, to make fear communal so it doesn't become private. Static visual cue. Zoom in on an old musket and cartridge pouch. Imagine the weight of powder and lead bouncing against your ribs as you run. There's a rule that shocks outsiders. These soldiers are, in effect, married to the king. Not romance, policy. It means no ordinary family, no competing loyalties, no children tugging at your sleeve when the drums call. Some women may feel relief, escaping an unwanted marriage. Others feel the quiet grief of a door closing forever. Either way, Dahomey is making a bargain with their future. Legend versus evidence moment number 2. European visitors love to describe the training as pure savagery. Women too wild to be human. But even the harsh accounts point to a recognizable military logic. Drill, hierarchy, rewards, punishment, and a culture designed to make soldiers do what soldiers everywhere are trained to do. Advance when every instinct screams to stop. And why would a king invest like this? Because Dahomey is playing a dangerous game on the coast. Guns flow in, wealth flows out, and people, captives, are the currency that turns into power. In the face of that, one recruit's inner conflict is simple and brutal. If she becomes the best, she lives. If she fails, she disappears. The drumming doesn't care. By the time the sun burns the mist away, she has learned something terrifying. The army will give her purpose. But purpose, in Dahomey, always comes with a price, and we're about to see who pays it. Look at the coastline on a map, and you'll see the problem. Ports like Ouidah sit on the edge of the Atlantic like open mouths. Europeans arrive with ships and contracts. Inland states arrive with armies and demands. Dahomey, wedged behind them, wants a seat at the table, but the table is covered in blood. In the early 1700s, Dahomey expands hard. Cities are taken, tribute is extracted, and the kingdom fights to loosen the grip of larger powers like Oyo, who expect payments in cowries, cloth, and people. Imagine a still painting of a royal procession, umbrellas of bright cloth, drummers, courtiers, and behind them, soldiers carrying trophies. It's political theater, and it works, until it doesn't. Static visual cue. Show an engraving of the port of Ouidah. Notice the ships offshore and the crowded beach, trade made visible. The Amazons, still forming into a true core, begin to matter in a new way. In a palace full of factions, princes, ministers, merchants, priests, loyalty is the rarest weapon. A king can buy muskets, but he can't easily buy devotion. Women trained and housed inside the royal system are, from his point of view, a safer bet. Here's the mistake most outsiders make. They treat the Amazons as a novelty and the kingdom as a backdrop. In reality, Dahomey is an engine. It organizes raids, tribute, diplomacy, and ritual into one machine designed to keep the throne standing. And inside that machine, individual motives collide. A commander wants glory and rank. A young soldier wants safety and belonging. A king wants control and fears, in the dark, that control is always temporary. By the mid-1800s, under King Gizo, the corps grows in size and prestige, drilled harder, paraded more loudly, used as a symbol of national strength. The kingdom is flexing for rivals and for Europeans who are starting to talk less about trade and more about civilizing. But when Europeans change the rules of the game, Dahomey faces a choice it cannot avoid. And the Amazons, once the king's secret advantage, are about to become the center of the storm. Now the camera, your imagination's camera, moves from the parade ground to the council room. It's dim, cool compared to the outside, and it smells of wood smoke and iron. King Gizo sits surrounded by ministers who speak in careful phrases, because everyone knows the truth. Dahomey's wealth has been built on Atlantic demand, and Atlantic demand is starting to shift. Britain is pushing hard against the transatlantic slave trade. Ships are intercepted, pressure builds, moral language becomes a weapon. At the same time, traders talk up legitimate commerce, palm oil, cloth, peanuts. It sounds cleaner. It might even be safer. But changing an economy is like turning a war canoe in a river current. You can do it, but you'll lose something on the way. Static visual cue. Show a close-up of palm fruits or oil in a calabash, ordinary objects that suddenly mean politics. Inside the army, the Amazons feel the change as orders. Fewer coastal raids? More border skirmishes? More parades designed for foreign eyes? One veteran officer, scarred, proud, worries that diplomacy will make soldiers soft. A younger recruit quietly hopes diplomacy will mean she doesn't have to march out and burn someone else's village. Legend versus evidence moment number 3. European newspapers loved to sensationalize Dahomey's court rituals, especially human sacrifice, as if the kingdom existed only to shock. The evidence from multiple accounts, including African oral traditions and outside observers, shows something more complicated. Ritual and violence were real, yes, but they were also governance, intimidation, and statecraft. In other words, not random cruelty, structured power, which is sometimes even more chilling. After Gizo, King Gliel inherits the throne and the problem. He doubles down on military display, because display is bargaining. The Amazons become the kingdom's living flag, proof that Dahomey is not a weak state to be bullied. And then, on the coast, the French arrive with treaties, flags, and a very modern idea. Paperwork that claims land without firing a shot. On a map, it looks like a few dots, Cotonou, Porto Novo. In real life, it's a noose being tied slowly. The question is, will Dahomey notice before it's tight? And if it does notice, what does it do with an army that's been trained never to back down? Fast forward to the late 1800s and look at a colonial map. Straight lines, neat labels, the kind of confidence you only get when you're drawing borders for someone else's home. Along the coast, France is planting flags in places like Porto Novo and Cotonou, turning trading posts into protectorates, then turning protectorates into excuses. To Dahomey, this feels like theft done with ink. To the French, it's order. To local rivals of Dahomey, French support is a chance to settle scores. Everyone has motives. Nobody admits them out loud. Static visual cue. Hold on an image of a European fort on the coast, stone walls facing the sea, cannons pointing inland like a threat disguised as architecture. In 1889, Behanzin takes the throne. He's portrayed later as a villain or a doomed hero, depending on who is telling the story. In reality, he's a ruler trapped in a tightening trap. He wants sovereignty, but he also wants time. Time to arm, to negotiate, to keep the kingdom's internal factions loyal. His private conflict is simple. Every concession buys peace today and weakness tomorrow. The Amazons, now seasoned and numerous, can feel the new enemy before the court admits it. French rifles fire faster. French artillery reaches farther. And still, an Amazon officer might think, if we don't fight, we die slowly anyway. In the markets, rumors spread like smoke. The French will ban raids, change taxes, demand hostages, dismantle the king. Some people secretly welcome the change. Others would rather face bullets than surrender the old order. Behanzin tries diplomacy, and diplomacy fails the way it often fails when one side believes it has the future in its pocket. A disputed border here, a customs post there, a clash with Porto Novo's forces, and suddenly the paperwork has teeth. Look at the map again. The coast is the doorway, and France is stepping inside. In the next chapter, the stepping turns into marching. The first shots will be fired, and the world will learn what happens when a small kingdom meets a modern empire and refuses to kneel. April 1890. The air near Cotonou tastes like salt and burned powder. Imagine a still photo taken just after a volley. Smoke hanging low, palm trunks scarred, the ground littered with torn leaves and spent cartridges. Behind French earthworks, sailors and colonial troops grip rifles that can fire again and again without the slow ritual of pouring powder down a barrel. Across that open ground, Dahomey advances. The Amazons are not charging for spectacle. They're doing what they were trained to do: close distance, break the line, make the fort irrelevant. Their officers push them forward with songs that sound almost cheerful, because if you sing, you breathe, and if you breathe, you keep moving. Static visual cue. Zoom in on a French naval gun or a cannon barrel. Cold metal, industrial certainty. This is where myth meets physics. Courage is real, but so is rate of fire. French positions at the coast are reinforced by fortifications and, at times, naval support from the sea. Dahomey's attacks are fierce, and they shock the French. especially the sight of women leading assaults, but the defenses hold. Inside Behanzon's mind is a terrible calculation. Every failed attack costs irreplaceable soldiers, but retreat costs something too: reputation, authority, the belief that the king can protect the kingdom. For the Amazons, the inner conflict is more intimate. They have been shaped into an identity where backing down feels like erasing yourself. Quick contrast, pattern interrupt. Hold the image of a Dahomey warrior next to a European rifle mechanism. One is muscle and ritual. The other is springs and mass production. Which one wins a long fight? The 1890 fighting ends not with a decisive battlefield victory, but with a treaty, the kind of peace that feels like swallowing a stone. France secures its position on the coast and its influence over Porto Novo. Dahomey gains breathing room, but the room is shrinking. And here's the twist. Everyone walks away convinced the next round is inevitable. The French go home talking about pacification. Dahomey goes home sharpening spears and buying more guns, because the kingdom has learned something it refuses to accept. The coast is no longer negotiable. In the quiet after the drums, Behanzon looks inland and starts planning a war he may not be able to win, but cannot afford to avoid. Peace, in Dahomey, is not silence. It's the sound of sharpening. Picture a still image of the royal arsenal, racks of muskets of different ages, some with cracked stocks, some newer, all smelling of oil and old smoke. Courtiers count powder like accountants. Messengers run between villages with summons that feel like storms on paper. Behanzon is trying to do in months what Europe did in decades: prepare for a second round with an empire. Static visual cue. Show a portrait of King Behanzon. Notice the gaze, the mix of pride and fatigue that painters can't quite hide. Behanzon's motive is not simply resist the French. It's to keep the kingdom coherent. If he looks weak, rivals inside Dahomey will smell it. If he looks reckless, he will bleed the country white. In his private moments, he must wonder whether his throne is a shield or a target. The Amazons train harder. Veterans teach recruits how to move through tall grass without sound, how to keep formation even when the first line falls. Songs become sharper, more defiant. Some women crave battle because battle is where they are valued. Others, older now, carry a quieter fear that the next war will not honor bravery the way the old wars did. Legend versus evidence moment number 4. Later accounts sometimes claim the Amazons fought in a trance, immune to pain. What the reports actually show, French officers included, is something more human and more impressive: discipline. They advanced under fire, regrouped, returned to the attack. Not magic. Training. Meanwhile, France is not improvising. It is planning. It builds supply lines, recruits African troops under French command, maps routes, calculates river crossings. A new commander, Colonel Alfred Dodds, is chosen, experienced, methodical, not easily rattled by spectacle. Pattern interrupt. Look at a French campaign map with arrows pointing inland. Those arrows aren't just lines. They're weeks of marching, thousands of meals, stacks of ammunition. By 1892, the French expedition begins moving like a machine. Dahomey's scouts report columns, rifles, artillery. The drums in Abomey answer back, and the Amazons assemble with a calm that feels like a dare. In the next chapter, we march with the French into the interior, and you'll feel, step by step, how inevitability is manufactured. The French column moves inland like a slow knife. Imagine a still photograph of a narrow path cut through green. Soldiers in single file, sweat-darkened uniforms, porters bent under crates of shells. Every step is negotiated with humidity, insects, and the simple fact that you can't carry an empire on your back without help. Static visual cue. Pause on an old photo of West African terrain. Tall grass, dense trees, a road that vanishes into shadow. Dahomey doesn't wait behind walls. It harasses, scouts, tests, and then it strikes. Near the Weem River, at places like Dogba, Dahomey launches attacks meant to break the column's nerve. In your mind's camera, see it at dawn. A burst of movement from the brush, war cries slicing through the bird calls, Amazons and male soldiers charging into rifle fire. For a few terrifying seconds, the French line wobbles, because any line can wobble when the enemy refuses to behave. An Amazon officer's inner conflict flashes in the middle of it. If we retreat, they march. If we advance, we die. That is not strategy. That is the cliff edge of sovereignty. The French answer with discipline of their own. Squares, controlled volleys, artillery that turns trees into splinters. The smell changes from wet earth to scorched sap. Dahomey's attacks are repelled, but not easily. French reports note the persistence, the repeated assaults, the strange shock of seeing women close to bayonet range. Pattern interrupt. Compare two stills, one of a Dahomey war banner, one of a French ammunition crate stamped with numbers. One is spirit, one is logistics. Both are power. After Dogba, something shifts. Behanzin realizes the French can be slowed, but not stopped at the edges. Dodds realizes Dahomey will not collapse from one hard fight. So both sides lean in. The war stops being a series of skirmishes and becomes a race. Can Dahomey bleed the column before it reaches the heartland? Can France reach Abomey before disease and distance hollow it out? Look at the map again and trace the French arrows toward the capital. Because the next battles will not be on the fringes. They will be at Dahomey's front door, and the Amazons will make sure that door does not open quietly. If you want one still image that explains the turning point, make it this. A road lined with smoke, the sky bruised purple, and in the distance the silhouette of Abomey, Dahomey's heart, under threat. As the French advance, Dahomey does something both ancient and modern. It weaponizes the landscape. Villages empty. Supplies vanish. Trails become traps. And when the fighting tightens near places like Kana, the clashes are brutal, close, confusing. Rifle cracks, screams, the wet thud of bodies in grass. Static visual cue. Show a battlefield painting or a photograph of infantry in tall grass. Notice how quickly a human figure disappears in green. The Amazons throw themselves into attacks designed to shock and stall. French accounts describe repeated assaults, sometimes at dawn, sometimes from the flank, always with a refusal to know their place. The women are taking casualties that would break many armies. But their training has taught them a strange kind of freedom. If death is already priced in, you can spend yourself without bargaining. Behanzin faces the decision every ruler dreads: abandon the capital or lose the army defending it. And then, in a move that feels like heartbreak turned into policy, Abomey is set ablaze before the French can claim it intact. Flames climb the palace walls, licking over carved doors and painted symbols. The smoke is not just destruction, it's a message. You may take the ground, but you will not take the story. Inside Behanzin's mind is a painful irony. The capital's rituals once proved divine authority. Now the fire proves something else. Human choice, desperate and proud. For an Amazon watching the palace burn, the inner conflict is unbearable. She has been taught to die for the king, and now the king is killing the city she swore to protect. Pattern interrupt. Freeze on a photo of Abomey's bas-reliefs. Then imagine them vanishing behind smoke. History is flammable. The French enter Abomey in November 1892 and declare success. But Behanzin is not captured. He retreats, pulling what remains of his forces north, turning the war into pursuit. And that's the new suspense. France has the capital, but does it have the king? Because as long as Behanzin is free, Dahomey is not quite conquered, and the Amazons still have a war to finish. Take a breath and look at the victory photo. French officers posing in a captured capital, boots on scorched ground, faces arranged into calm triumph. It's the kind of image empires love because it tells a simple story. The trouble is, the simple story isn't true yet. Outside Abomey, the war drags on. Behanzin moves through the interior with the remaining core of his forces, trying to keep allies loyal and enemies uncertain. The French chase with patrols and diplomacy, offering amnesty here, punishment there, classic divide and rule with a fresh coat of administration. Static visual cue. Show a colonial proclamation or a treaty document, paper that pretends it can replace drumbeats. For the Amazons, this phase is the hardest. In set battles, they had purpose: advance, hold, break. In pursuit and exhaustion, purpose phrase. Food is scarce. Ammunition dwindles. Some soldiers slip away at night, not from cowardice, but from the slow realization that the kingdom they were built to defend is dissolving behind them. An Amazon commander feels a new, humiliating emotion: doubt. Not can I fight, But what am I fighting for now? And Behanzin feels it too. He can keep running, keep skirmishing, keep refusing. But each month costs lives he cannot replace. And each loss makes surrender more likely to be surrender without dignity. In early 1894, Behanzin finally yields. He is taken into exile, first across the ocean, later farther away, removed like a chess piece so the board can be reset. It's a political magic trick. The king disappears, and France announces the kingdom has disappeared with him. Legend versus evidence moment number 5. You'll sometimes hear that every Amazon fought to the last woman, vanishing in one final stand. The evidence points to a messier, more human end. Many were killed in the wars, yes, but others survived, returned to villages, married, aged, and carried memories that didn't fit colonial myths. So here's the haunting question. What happens to an elite warrior caste when the state that made it is gone? Because the next chapter isn't about battlefields. It's about silence, and the people who refuse to let silence win. Imagine a still photograph taken a few years later. A colonial parade with brass instruments, flags, and men in new uniforms marching to a rhythm imported from Europe. The sound is bright, almost cheerful, and if you listen carefully, you can hear what's missing, the old drums that once set the tempo of the kingdom. The Amazons are disarmed, dispersed, and, in many cases, deliberately forgotten. Colonial rule doesn't just conquer territory, it edits memory. A former Amazon who once carried a rifle now carries water, or farms, or sells cloth in a market where people pretend not to recognize the scars on her arms. She has an inner conflict no treaty can solve. She was trained to be exceptional, and now she is expected to be invisible. Static visual cue. Show a portrait photograph of a West African woman from the early 1900s. Study the hands, the posture, the unreadable calm. Some French officials romanticize the Amazons as a curiosity, a story to tell at dinner parties. Others demonize them to justify conquest. Either way, the women themselves are rarely asked what they thought, what they feared, what they wanted. Their identities are repackaged, like a Netflix docuseries that keeps the dramatic soundtrack but cuts the inconvenient context. Pattern interrupt. Hold up two images side by side, an Amazon with a weapon and a colonial administrative office with paperwork stacked high. One is force, one is bureaucracy. Both can crush. And yet, memory leaks through. Travelers mention meeting older women who once marched with Behanzin. Local stories persist, pass quietly. In the 20th century, researchers and journalists begin to realize the Amazons weren't a legend at all. They were veterans, living proof that the colonial version of the past was incomplete. But now a new danger appears, not colonial erasure, but modern simplification. The Amazons become symbols of feminism, of African warrior spirit, of exotic spectacle, sometimes without their contradictions, their ties to a violent state, their personal costs. So the question turns again. Can we tell their story without turning them into props? Because in the next chapter, we'll watch the Amazons walk into the modern imagination and see how myths are manufactured in the age of cameras. Now we jump, like a hard cut in a documentary, from dusty archives to modern spotlights. The Amazons reappear in photographs, museum displays, academic books, and, eventually, movies. And the tone changes. Where colonial writers once sneered, modern audiences often cheer. That swing tells you as much about us as it does about them. Static visual cue. Show a black and white photograph of Dahomey women soldiers from the late 19th century. Notice the uniforms, the weapons, the direct stare that refuses to be a background detail. Here's the gamble of storytelling. If you make them only victims of colonialism, you flatten their agency. If you make them only heroes, you bleach the kingdom they served. Dahomey's state power was real. Its wars were real. Its participation in violent economies was real. And also, these women's discipline, bravery, and skill were undeniably real. Two truths sharing one frame. Legend versus evidence moment number 6. Pop culture sometimes treats the core as a perfect sisterhood of freedom fighters. The evidence shows a more complicated institution, elite, respected, but also tightly controlled by the monarchy, with harsh discipline and a role in enforcing the king's will. They were empowered, yes, and instrumentalized. A former Amazon, late in life, might carry that contradiction like a stone. Pride in her unit, grief for friends lost, anger at foreign guns, anger at her own leaders, relief that she survived, shame that survival required things she can't describe without flinching. Pattern interrupt. Look at an artifact, perhaps a blade or a uniform button, in a museum case. It sits under soft lighting, silent. But once, that object bounced with every footstep on a march toward a village that didn't know it was about to change forever. Modern films, when they touch this story, often compress time, simplify politics, and rearrange motives. That's not a crime. It's cinema. But it's our job, as viewers, to keep one eye on the screen and one eye on the map. Because the next chapter brings us back to a single human being, an elderly veteran remembered by name, whose quiet testimony cuts through both colonial slander and modern hype. Picture this still image, an elderly woman sitting in shade, light filtering through leaves onto her hands. The hands are what you notice first, thickened knuckles, veins like river branches, fingers that have gripped farm tools, and, long ago, weapons. In the 20th century, visitors to Benin recorded meetings with women said to be among the last surviving veterans of the Dahomey Corps. One of the names that surfaces in these accounts is Nawi, remembered as a fighter from the final wars and interviewed late in life, when the Franco-Dahomeyan Wars were already a distant echo. Static visual cue. Linger on a portrait of an older woman's face, wrinkles not as age, but as a map of endurance. She describes, in fragments, what a photograph can't capture: the smell of powder, the sting of sweat in the eyes, the sudden quiet after a volley when you can hear someone breathing beside you and realize that breathing is a miracle. And then the moment that stays, seeing French firepower up close and understanding, with a cold clarity, that bravery doesn't stop bullets. Her inner conflict is almost unbearable. She is proud of how fiercely she fought, and yet she knows the fight ended in exile and loss. If she admits the kingdom did terrible things, does that stain her courage? If she refuses to admit it, does she become a mouthpiece for a propaganda she no longer serves? Pattern interrupt. Hold on the map again and trace the route from the coast to Abomey. Now trace, with your finger, the invisible route of exile, across the ocean, away from the land. Conquest isn't only soldiers, it's removal. When she finishes speaking, there is often a pause in the written notes, a sense that the interviewer didn't quite know what to do with a living contradiction. A woman who was both instrument and agent, both feared and, somehow, tender. And that brings us to the final turn. What does modern Benin do with a legacy like that? Because the last chapter isn't about winning. It's about remembering, and deciding what kind of remembering is honest. Return to the opening image, the torchlight, the drums, the line of women stepping forward. Now add a second still image beside it, modern Abomey's ruins and museums. Visitors walking slowly past palace walls that survived fire, weather, and politics. The air is quieter now, but the symbols remain: carved reliefs, royal emblems, stories that refuse to be filed away. Static visual cue. Hold on a photo of the Abomey Palace's bas-reliefs. Notice how a simple animal or blade becomes a sentence. So what is the legacy of the Dahomey Amazons? It isn't a single thing. For Benin, they can be national pride, proof that African states built institutions, armies, and strategy long before Europeans wrote them into footnotes. For historians, they are a challenge, a case where gender, power, and violence do not line up neatly with modern expectations. For modern viewers, they are a mirror, showing how quickly we turn complicated humans into tidy symbols. And for the women themselves, if we could hear them without translation or agenda, the legacy might be more personal. A remembered march, a friend lost in tall grass, a moment of terror swallowed and converted into movement, a lifetime spent carrying the knowledge that you were feared and then ignored. Behanzon's exile ends the kingdom as it was, but not the question it raises. How does a society create loyalty strong enough to face cannon fire? Dahomey's answer was the Mino, women trained into an elite corps, bound to the throne, celebrated and controlled in the same breath. Pattern interrupt. Zoom out to the map of West Africa again. Kingdoms rise and fall, borders redraw, languages shift. And yet a story can outlive a state. Next time you see a painting of Amazons, don't just see spectacle. See logistics. See politics. See the cost of belonging. See a woman standing in heat and smoke, choosing to step forward because stepping back would mean becoming nobody. And if that choice makes you uneasy, good. Unease is where honest history starts. Because the drums are still there, faintly, under the silence, and once you've heard them, you can't quite unhear them.